The word, homophobic, was first coined in the late 1960s or early 1970s by psychologist George Weinberg. Weinberg used the term in his book, Society and the Healthy Homosexual, to describe a fear or hatred of homosexuals. Prior to this, there was no widely recognized term to describe this phenomenon. Weinberg created the word, homophobia, by combining the Greek words, homo, meaning same, and phobia, meaning fear. He intended it to be used to describe both an irrational fear of homosexuality and a prejudice against homosexuals. The term gained widespread usage in the 1970s and 1980s as the gay rights movement grew and brought issues related to discrimination against homosexuals into the public consciousness. Today, the word, homophobic, is commonly used to describe any attitudes or actions that are hostile or discriminatory towards homosexuals. Homophobia has a complex and multifaceted history, which can be traced back to many cultural and historical factors. Religious beliefs, societal norms, and cultural traditions have all played a role in shaping attitudes towards homosexuality. In many societies, homosexuality was historically considered taboo and immoral, and it was often punished by law or even death. This has contributed to the negative attitudes towards homosexuality that are still present today in many parts of the world. The word, homophobic, itself has evolved over time, and it has come to encompass a range of attitudes and behaviors towards homosexuality. Some people may have a deep-seated fear or discomfort around homosexuality, while others may hold prejudiced views or engage in discriminatory behavior towards LGBTQ+ individuals. In recent decades, efforts have been made to combat homophobia and promote acceptance and equality for LGBTQ+ people. This has included legal reforms, such as the decriminalization of homosexuality in many countries, as well as social and cultural changes aimed at challenging harmful stereotypes and promoting diversity and inclusion. However, despite these efforts, homophobia and discrimination against LGBTQ+ people still exist in many parts of the world, and much work remains to be done to promote equality and acceptance for all individuals, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. The history of homosexuality during slavery is a complex and often overlooked topic, but there is evidence to suggest that same-sex relationships did occur among enslaved people. Enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas from diverse cultural backgrounds, and some of these cultures had different attitudes towards same-sex relationships than the dominant European culture. For example, in some African societies, same-sex relationships were considered a normal and accepted part of life. Enslaved people were also subjected to harsh and dehumanizing conditions, which often meant that they had limited control over their own lives and bodies. Some historians have suggested that same-sex relationships may have provided a way for enslaved people to find emotional support and intimacy in the midst of their difficult circumstances. However, there is also evidence to suggest that same-sex relationships among enslaved people were often met with violence and punishment. Many slave owners and overseers were deeply religious and held strong moral objections to homosexuality, and same-sex relationships were often seen as a threat to the social order of the plantation. Furthermore, the legal and social structures of slavery made it difficult for enslaved people to form lasting relationships or build families. Many enslaved people were separated from their partners and children as a result of the slave trade and forced labor, which further undermined the possibility of stable same-sex relationships. Overall, the history of homosexuality during slavery is complex and varied, and more research is needed to fully understand the experiences of LGBTQ+ people in this context. However, it is clear that the legacy of slavery has had a lasting impact on the lives of LGBTQ+ people of African descent, and that this history must be acknowledged and addressed in efforts to promote equality and justice for all. There is evidence to suggest that some enslaved individuals in the Americas engaged in same-sex relationships. However, due to the oppressive and often violent conditions of slavery, it was difficult for enslaved people to express their sexuality openly and safely. Many slave owners and overseers held moral objections to homosexuality, and same-sex relationships were often punished with violence or other forms of abuse. Additionally, the legal and social structures of slavery made it difficult for enslaved people to form lasting relationships or build families. Despite these obstacles, there are historical accounts and archival records that suggest that some enslaved individuals formed same-sex relationships. For example, there are letters and diaries from white plantation owners and observers that describe instances of same-sex behavior among enslaved people. Furthermore, some scholars have argued that same-sex relationships among enslaved people served as a form of resistance against the oppressive system of slavery. By forming intimate connections with one another, enslaved people were able to find comfort and support in a hostile environment. It is important to note, however, that the experiences of LGBTQ+ people during slavery varied widely depending on factors such as their gender, race, and geographical location. More research is needed to fully understand the complexities of this history and its ongoing impact on the lives of LGBTQ+ people of African descent. There is evidence to suggest that homosexuality and same-sex relationships have existed in various African societies throughout history. However, attitudes towards homosexuality have varied widely depending on cultural and historical factors. Many traditional African societies had different attitudes towards homosexuality than those that were brought by European colonialism. For example, in some African cultures, same-sex relationships were considered a normal and accepted part of life, while in others, they were taboo or prohibited. Historical evidence of homosexuality in Africa can be found in a variety of sources, including art, literature, and oral traditions. For example, there are depictions of same-sex relationships in ancient Egyptian art and literature, as well as in the oral traditions of many West and Central African societies. Despite the existence of homosexuality in many African societies, LGBTQ+ people have often faced discrimination and persecution in modern times. This is due in part to the influence of European colonialism, which introduced Western attitudes towards homosexuality and reinforced the idea that it was immoral or unnatural. Today, many African countries still have laws that criminalize homosexuality, and LGBTQ+ people often face harassment, violence, and discrimination. However, there are also many activists and organizations working to promote acceptance and equality for LGBTQ+ people in Africa, and to challenge harmful stereotypes and discriminatory laws. It is incorrect and harmful to say that homosexuality was invented by Caucasian people or any other group of people. Homosexuality is a natural and complex aspect of human sexuality that has been present in many societies throughout history, including in non-Western cultures. The idea that homosexuality is a Western invention or a product of Western decadence is a myth that has been perpetuated by colonialism, imperialism, and cultural imperialism. European colonizers often imposed their own views on gender and sexuality on the societies they colonized, and this has had a lasting impact on attitudes towards homosexuality in many parts of the world. However, historical evidence and anthropological research suggest that same-sex relationships and behaviors have existed in many non-Western cultures throughout history. For example, in many African societies, same-sex relationships were a normal and accepted part of life before the arrival of European colonizers. Furthermore, the idea that homosexuality is a choice or a lifestyle is also a myth that has been perpetuated by prejudice and misinformation. Scientific research has shown that sexual orientation is a complex and deeply ingrained aspect of human identity that is not a choice. It is important to reject harmful myths and stereotypes about homosexuality and to promote acceptance and equality for LGBTQ+ people of all cultures and backgrounds.